This is a Viva PR podcast.
There's always that bullet point at the end of every crisis plan. Don't forget the internal comms audience. There's never much more than that. An organisation that doesn't include internal comms is not really meeting its full potential. But at worst, what we're doing is we're causing increased harm. So in the very first instance, it's surviving, keeping people safe from harm, preventing harm. That has to be the priority.
When a crisis hits, PR professionals leap into action, crafting statements, fronting the media and firefighting on every front. Then, within hours, newsrooms and LinkedIn feeds light up with the analysis on how well or how badly a brand handled the external fallout. But there's one audience that too often gets forgotten: the people inside the organisation, the employees. So in this episode of PR in the Real World, we're joined by Alison Arnot, founder of Catalyst Communications and author of a brand new book on the subject of internal comms in times of crisis. Drawing on her frontline experience, Alison makes a really compelling case for putting people-first comms at the heart of every crisis plan. It's about securing employee trust, support and advocacy in crisis situations. This conversation will surely resonate with anyone who believes that crisis comms isn't just about headlines, it's about the humans. Let's get to it. So, Alison, thanks so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to this conversation. Can we start at the beginning? Because you've had a really kind of fascinating career of aviation, rail, higher education, and now consultancy and training. But what originally drew you into the PR and in particular, internal comms side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like a lot of people of my generation, PR wasn't necessarily a career that I was aware of when I was growing up. So when I was growing up and going through school and talking to my careers guidance teachers, they were talking to me about potentially primary school teaching or cabin crew, jobs like that, which actually would have been a good fit for me, but it wasn't something that I was super passionate about. So I ended up, when I left school, I ended up going to university and studying retail management. And while I was there doing that studying, I kind of recognized that actually I was quite interested in business strategy, which surprised me. But I also had a part-time job working in a media monitoring agency. And it was there that I came to realize actually there is this job called public relations. And it's something that's potentially open to me in Glasgow. And I loved working at media monitoring. Basically, my job was to read the newspapers every day. So I would go in and I would get, 6 or 7 newspapers, and I had to read them for different clients and kind of cut out points of interest. And I found it really interesting how different stories were approached differently in different publications. And I worked there for a while, and I came to see actually how images were used differently to tell this story. I found that really interesting as well. So I kind of realized that this kind of media PR thing was something that I was interested in. And I was lucky enough at uni to see my first PR role advertised in the university, went for the interview and was really lucky to walk out of university basically into a job. And that job was it was a PR kind of assistant role, but it had a good mix of media relations, which at that time I thought PR was, and also internal comms, which I came to really, really enjoy. And I was kind of, I was really interested in that organization to see how the external publicity actually affected the people inside the organization. And internal comms became a passion for me. It's not something I've focused on through my whole career. Sometimes I've been a generalist, sometimes I've been a specialist. But when I've been a specialist, it's really that internal comm side that I've focused on.
Interesting. So tell us about your consultancy, Catalyst Communications. What kind of work does that get involved in?
Sure. Okay, so I established Catalyst back in 2012. We do a mix of kind of project work and consultancy. It's a small organization. We pride ourselves on a very personal service. We pride ourselves on really getting to know our clients and working with them almost as a member of the team rather than someone who dips in and out. But more recently, I've always offered training as part of the service, but more recently that's really come to the fore. And a lot of what we do now through Catalyst is training in PR, internal comms, and obviously my specialism is internal crisis communication, and that's something that we both consult and train on.
I mean, you've advised on lots of different crisis situations over the years, but your first experience was a major one, wasn't it? It's the Glasgow Airport terror attack. Can you remind listeners about that and talk about your role that day?
Yeah, absolutely. That was my first experience of a major crisis. I had observed them. I'd worked in the rail industry already. I'd worked in the aviation industry, so I've observed them from afar, but I hadn't actually been involved in the room until that point. So at Glasgow Airport back in 2007, a terror attack happened. A Jeep loaded with explosives drove into an entrance to the main terminal building. On a Saturday afternoon, a very busy summer Saturday afternoon. It then got stuck in the door and went up in flames. My formal role at the airport at that time was internal communication, but because it was a Saturday, because we operated an on-call rota, I also attended the crisis room on behalf of the PR and comms team in those very early stages, from probably about half an hour after the attack happened, right through till about 11 o'clock at night when another colleague came into the crisis room to take over.
What do you remember most about that day then? Because something like that, particularly like in your formative years, is going to stick with you, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, when people talk about crisis, sometimes they say there are things they remember really vividly, and there are things that quite quickly kind of fade away. That's definitely my experience. So one of my really vivid memories was kind of in the very early moments. It was a Saturday. I was at home in the flat. I was actually taking washing out of my washing machine. I'd been at a wedding the night before, so it was slightly worse for wear, but not as hungover as I have been at times in my life, luckily. So I was in the flat, I was pottering around, and I was kind of expecting a quiet day. I was part of the on-call team, but I wasn't on call that day. Obviously, I'd been out the night before and so on. However, I had my pager switched on. We used pagers back in those days, and I had my pager switched on, and I heard the pager going off, which wasn't unusual. And then I heard it go off again and again and again and again. And I thought, gosh, something really strange is happening. So I went to have a look at the pager out of nosiness more than anything else. And I saw that there was a lot of calls coming in, and something told me, something's going on here. Something's not quite right. So I contacted my colleague who was on call just to basically ask him if he was okay. Did he need me to kind of give him a hand for a couple of minutes or whatever, because I wasn't busy? And he said that something had happened at the airport. He thought it was a car crash. He was quite far away. Yeah. And he wanted to go there. I could tell that he really wanted to go there. I could tell that he knew it was important. And I said, listen, I'm really close. I'll go for you. I'm not doing anything. So that's how I came to be in the room. So I remember then driving in my car, staying on the phone to him through the kind of handheld phone thing that we had at the time, driving in my car to the airport, approaching the airport and realizing this is serious. There was a police cordon in the front of the airport, and I was escorted into the crisis room. My memories from there are very much about the people. Yeah. I remember walking into the room and seeing the people in the room and thinking, thank goodness it's these people, because I knew they were good people to be working with. And as more people came in, obviously, because they'd all been traveling from different places as well, seeing the people coming into the room, I felt a real sense of security and a sense that we were all in good hands. I was also, although I was the only comms person in the room, I wasn't the only comms person doing the job. So my colleague who had been on the phone to before, he was very, very active from where he was on the phone. And my manager as well, my comms director, he was very, very active from his home as well. So it was kind of hybrid working before hybrid working was a thing. But as a team, I remember that teamwork kind of working really well. And again, obviously, that I remember shaping the messages and discussing what we knew, finding out what had happened and what we did and didn't know. I can remember all of that and kind of having quite deep discussions about the comms that we needed to put out. I remember feeling very supported by the crisis management team in their understanding of the need for comms, not just for media, but also for all of our stakeholders, so that they felt involved in the situation, so that they were enabled in the situation. And again, that's my memories in the weeks that followed. Obviously, the crisis, you have the big bang, but then it goes on for a long time. The impact goes on afterwards. We were brilliant with our business recovery. We had recovered the organization so much that we were able to have the first flight leave within 24 hours after the attack had happened. And that was something that we used in our messaging and so on to instill confidence in the airport. But obviously there's a lot of challenges going on behind the scenes there. And in the weeks that followed, my overwhelming memory of that situation was the way that the people stepped forward. Everyone stepped forward as a team. Everyone really, really gave their best in that situation. And I think that was something that they could all be rightly proud of.
Yeah. What was the internal comms element of that situation that you can remember, and how well do you think that was handled in hindsight?
I think the internal comms was handled really well. It's what kind of confirmed to me the need for good internal comms. In the very early stages, it was operationally led. It was led by team leaders and so on. Obviously, we had very visible leadership in the airport, and our senior managers were out and about. But a lot of the comms in those very early stages was in the small teams, in the huddles and so on. We used all of our normal channels to communicate with staff. We had a staff newsletter back then, and in the weeks that followed the incident, we kind of recognized the roles that people played. We told the stories of what had happened. We talked about the difficulties. We talked about the successes. We really celebrated the team effort. We had a team Glasgow ethos, and we kind of celebrated that. We did a video where again we talked to different people about the roles that they played, and we did various different things from an internal comms perspective.
Well, that sounds like really good practice, but obviously that's not always the case. And it's often said that internal comms in a crisis is the Cinderella of crisis planning, that it sometimes gets forgotten about, like when you've mentioned that big bang idea, and all the focus is on how, externally. Do you agree, and do you think that there's a reason why that might be the case?
Yeah, I do agree. And it kind of baffles me. I would say, in addition to the internal comms, the reason why that crisis was kind of considered to be best practice was a lot to do with the operation. It was a lot to do with the business continuity, the fact that we recovered the business quickly. It was a lot to do with the leadership, and it was to do with the internal and external comms. So internal comms never exists in a bubble in a crisis. If you have other things going wrong, your comms isn't going to fix that. But when you're enabled, you can really help strengthen the organization and support the people. And I think that's what we did. But coming back to your question about internal comms, kind of it's always a Cinderella, I think the word you used.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been talking since the 1980s and the 1990s about the need to remember the internal audience in a crisis. There's always that bullet point or that kind of tick point at the end of every crisis plan. Don't forget the internal comms audience. Don't forget the employees. but there's never much more than that. And I think probably the reason for that is that there's not been a lot of really focused guidance on how to do it. So with external comms, you know, there's a lot of guidance and so on. There's lots of books. How do we do this? And with internal comms, until now, obviously, there's less of that. But it's really, really important. Your internal community, they're the people who know the crisis. For them, that crisis is very, very personal. They feel it in a different way to the people outside, regardless of the harm that's been caused and to who and to what type of crisis. And obviously there are lots of different types of crisis with lots of different types of impact. But regardless of that, inside the organization, the crisis is personal.
Yeah.
The people know it, they feel it, and importantly, they deal with it. So we need to, first of all, keep them safe. We need to keep them supported, and we need to keep them enabled as well.
And what are the risks if we don't do that, do you think?
Well, I mean, depends how hard you want to go. I mean, at best, I think an organization that doesn't include internal comms is not really meeting its full potential. But at worst, what we're doing is we're causing increased harm.
Yeah.
Or we're failing to minimize harm. We're prolonging the crisis and potentially disabling the crisis recovery from the inside out. So it can have quite significant ramifications. Sometimes people get away with it. We've seen that in organizations before. The internal comms response is not particularly good and they get away with it. But when they don't get away with it, that harm can be devastating, and it can actually prolong the crisis or even cause another crisis to happen.
You talk about the 7 S's of internal communications in your upcoming book, which we'll talk about a bit more. Can you walk us through what the 7 S's are and how they help shape a strategy if you're ever in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 7 S's is something that I have kind of observed through my career in different crises, and I've recognized that there are different human and different organizational needs that kind of appear in pretty much every crisis. And what I've observed over the years is sometimes we go at them in the wrong order. So what I was trying to do with the 7 S's was to help people think intentionally about the needs that we need to meet. So the 7 S's, 7 words, they all begin with S. The first 3 are human needs. So in the very first instance, it's surviving, keeping people safe from harm, preventing harm. That has to be the priority to my mind, and I know to the mind of a lot of other experts in this field. Very closely after that, you have the supporting needs. How do we support the people within the organization, perhaps not with their survival needs, but with other kind of psychological needs or practical needs? You know, supporting needs can be anything from counseling to information about when people are getting paid. It's different in every crisis, but we need to support them. And then again, coming very quickly on the back of that is that sense-making need. Sense-making is an idea that's been around in comms for a long, long time, but it's having a bit of a moment just now. Lots of people are talking about how we can use comms to help people make sense of complex situations. So sense-making is important because when a crisis happens, people are going to make sense of it regardless. They're going to go and search for information. They're going to talk to people. They're going to seek out information about what's happening, and they're going to decide how they feel about that, and therefore what they are going to do next. And so the organization has a responsibility to kind of facilitate that, to give them information that will help them make sense of what's happening and then enable them to function, I guess, in the organization. So then on the back of that, so we have surviving, supporting, sense making. We then move to the organizational needs. And as I say, this can all happen within the space of a couple of hours, or it can happen over days, weeks, whatever. But once you've helped make sure that people are safe, the surviving, the supporting, the sense making, you want to stabilize the organization. So how do we do that? Very quickly, once you've stabilized, how do we stimulate the crisis response? How do we enable the organization to start functioning again? And then on the back of that, we talked about the fact that some crises are long, they're drawn out. Once the immediate kind of adrenaline rush has gone, people can become tired. It can be very difficult through that long tail of crisis. So the sixth S is sustaining. How do we sustain people through this crisis? And then finally, the seventh is strengthening. How do we strengthen the organization? The challenge that most organizations face is that sometimes leaders want to go straight from crisis to strengthening. Yeah. My argument is you've got to go through all the steps if you want to do it as well as possible. As I said, sometimes it can happen very, very quickly within a matter of hours and you're ready to go. Other times it takes longer and there's a lot more to unpack. There's a lot more to help people through. You've got to go through the process that people need to go through if you want your organization to come back stronger and if you want your people to support and advocate for that organization in a meaningful way. So, to my view, it's a kind of universal understanding. It's something that I've observed, as I said, time and time again. But what I've done is I've just put it into a kind of a memorable kind of list of action points.
We've talked about crisis in the context of a terror attack, and thankfully that those are few and far between. But we see every day different examples of cybersecurity or just a food poisoning epidemic or whatever. And you must have come across lots of different types of crisis and how they impact internal audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Every crisis is different, and it's really important to understand not to make assumptions about the impact that the crisis is having on the people in the organization. It's really important to go out and about in the organization and understand how the crisis feels, because organizations are complex and they feel different in different parts of the organization, from different horizons, even in different locations. And so it's really important that we understand the crisis, but that we also understand the context it kind of evolved in, the organization, the community, and so on, and what that is going to mean for the crisis response as well.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. What do you think are some of the kind of bigger mistakes that you see organisations make when they're trying to manage their internal messaging during times of crisis?
For me, the biggest one is leaving it too late.
Right.
You've got to communicate quickly with your internal community. And you've got to communicate in a personal way. Often the advice is make sure you forward the press release to the internal community, to the employees. It's not enough, because immediately what you're signaling to them is they're less important than the external stakeholders. But also what you're doing is you're not giving them the information that they actually need. So you need to think forward. You need to prepare. What kinds of information will our employees need in a range of different crisis situations, so that you can be ready to act as quickly as we are. We talk about the golden hour, and that's now 10 minutes and all this kind of stuff, and we're always focusing on external comms when we talk about that. It's equally important internally, because what you don't want is your employees finding about their crisis, their personal crisis, from somebody who's less removed. So you need to act quickly, but you also need to be able to judge the mood, and you need to be able to role model very well as well, if you want to get the best possible response.
It's interesting that we've had previous guests on who were internal comms experts, and they were talking about how the lines are much more blurred these days between internal and external comms, in the sense that a lot of the employees will be picking up information about their organisation from LinkedIn or from news sources, and not necessarily from the intended internal comms
Yeah,
channel. So
yeah.
I guess you've got to be cognizant of that as well.
Absolutely right. I mean, everybody inside the organization is a human being with a real life outside of work. So, of course, they're going to be, seeking out information from all the places they would normally get information. Of course, they're going to be talking about the crisis. Um, Whether they advocate for the organization in the crisis or whether they kind of speak badly about the organization, that's up to you with inside the organization. How are you treating them? What experiences are they having? What are they observing within the organization? What information are they receiving from you? If they are having, regardless of the horror of the crisis, whatever type of crisis it is, but if they're having a good experience within the organization in terms of leadership, culture, psychological safety, communication, they're much more likely to advocate for you. And in fact, they can become very powerful in that outside world. And I'm not just talking about your employees, I'm talking about your contractors, volunteers, freelancers, anyone who's associated with the organization, who's seen to be part of it. They can go outside into the outside world and they can become very trustworthy sources of information themselves.
I mean, I think that's the point you argue in your book, isn't it? That internal comms isn't just about reacting in a crisis moment, but it can actually help prevent crises either happening or going, worse. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think listening is critical within
Right.
an organization. We always hear about these big dramatic crises that happen and they grab our attention and they feel shocking and unexpected. But actually, a huge number of crises can be foreseen. They're what we call smouldering crises. They're problems or difficulties that arise in the organization, sometimes for years, and they're ignored or they're passed about, or people feel that they're aware of them, but it's not their place to kind of raise the issue. So, and particularly now in the current environment that we're working in, where people are always expected to deliver more for less. We can see kind of corners being cut, or we can see things being done more quickly or less rigorously than perhaps they've been done in the past. And that can be a problem, as can things like toxic behaviors or whatever else is going on in an organization. So, internal comms can help, first of all, by creating that psychologically safe culture, by letting people know you are safe to bring up this problem, you are safe to share this. We will be grateful to you for the information you're bringing to us, rather than brand you as a troublemaker. And that happens a lot. There are people who see crises coming for a long time, and they try to warn about them and they're not taken seriously, and sometimes they're even kind of belittled or pushed out of the organization. So we need to make sure that when people are bringing issues to the table, that those issues are listened to. And internal comms can help with that listening out for the red flags. It can also help with communicating the organization's values, expected behaviors, even ways of doing things, and so on, that might kind of mitigate against these smoldering crises. It can't protect against everything, of course it can't, but it can help.
I guess what you're saying in this as well, that you need to have that steady state where the organisational leadership is trusted anyway, and trust is one of the things that's hard to earn and easy to lose. But how can organisations build that internal trust so that when if something bad does happen, that they're starting from a decent place?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, trust comes from experience, doesn't it?
Mm.
So people in the organization will be observing the organization all the time. They'll be observing how the organization treats them, how the organization treats the people around them, how it treats their other stakeholders, and they'll be making their mind up about the organization and the people in it all the time. So that's a big contributor to trust, obviously. But again, on above that, you've got that visible leadership. You know, you're more likely to trust an organization where the leaders and the line managers are visible, where they're role modeling the expected values and behaviors, where they're evidencing that they care about people, not just the people inside the organization, but the people outside of it. They're kind of backing up their words with action. And they're being open and transparent about how different decisions are made and so on. I think all of those things can help contribute to a more trusting culture.
Let's talk a little bit more in detail about the book. What inspired you to write it, and tell us like who's it aimed at?
I've been interested in this subject for a long time. I've been kind of training in it, or offering training in it for many years. Around about the time of COVID, I recognised that other people were starting to become much more interested in it, starting to talk about it in more detail as well. And I kind of felt in my own reading that there was a gap. There was either some quite academic stuff, which was interesting, really interesting, but hard to kind of put into practice. And then there was some very kind of superficial, you know, don't forget to send the email type thing. And there was nothing in the middle. And
No.
so I felt I had these ideas. As I said, I've been observing the things like the 7S, although I hadn't quite decided how that would look. I'd been observing these needs in different organizations, and I was aware of different patterns of communication that were effective in organizations. And I thought this might be the time to write the book. It was really intended for anyone with an interest in internal crisis comms, but particularly for those people who were like me in the very early days, who had this responsibility, who wanted to do it well, but who weren't 100% sure where to start. So it was intended to give them a place of confidence to kind of move forward from.
And how do you hope it's used? I'm guessing it's one of them where you kind of have to read it before you need it, kind of thing.
I mean, absolutely. I hope it people use it to kind of prepare. I know myself, I buy a lot of kind of business books, professional books. Some of them I've had for years and I've got the pages folded over. I've got lines in different points. I've got the post-it notes, and others I buy them and I kind of have a quick flick through and I think, yeah, I'm not going to bother with that today. I'll come back to it, and I never do. I really hope my book's the former. I really hope that people do read it and do find things of value in it. I hope that people underline the words and, you know, put post-it notes in and take action from it. All the training that I do is very action focused. It's always about helping people in organizations understand, okay, so we've learned this. How do we apply it? What do we do next? And I hope the book does that as well for people.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think with my agency hat on, we'll often be sat here, and one of our regular clients will give us a call and go, "Oh, something's happened. Can you help us out?" But what would your advice be for when we're stepping into a client's crisis like that? Because you said it's not enough just to parachute in with a template and you know the S's as you kind of model.
Yeah, definitely, you know, use the knowledge that's available to you, but the knowledge is part of the puzzle. You know, the theory is part of the puzzle. The real secret, I think, to crisis success is insight. And we kind of touched on this earlier, but, you know, really understanding the crisis, what happened, why did it happen, what is the impact going to be, being fully open and honest and non-defensive as you kind of discuss what happened and how are we going to fix it. But you also need to understand the context. And I think that's where agencies need to make an extra effort because people working in-house, they already know the organisation, they already know the context. They still have to really make an effort to understand their people. But when you're from an agency side, there's that extra effort, because people tell me, you know, when they have a crisis and an external agency is maybe brought in by the insurers or whatever it might be, and kind of encouraged to lead for that crisis, they know this isn't the company's voice. They know this isn't the normal comms. And it kind of brings a disconnect. And when you were talking about that trust, it's like, well, why?
Yeah.
Why is this happening? So they need to understand, what's the rhythm in that organization? How do people talk to each other? What channels do they use? What's going to resonate with people? What's going to inspire? And what's going to, because people will be concerned, you know, people will be disrupted. They will be worried. What's going to worry them further?
Yeah.
So it's just about getting in, getting to know. And as you say, you know, your agency, mine too, we work hard to know the people that, you know, we support long before any difficulty happens. But you know, particularly when something like that happens, you've got to get in about the organisation. You can't kind of do it a few steps removed.
What shifts would you like to see in the PR profession in how it values in internal comms and internal crisis comms in particular?
I'd like to see internal crisis comms really take its seat at the table as a strategic discipline. I'd like to see it working hand in hand with external comms all the time and occasionally ahead of. That's not to say external comms isn't important. Of course, external comms is important, but you know, we've talked about why internal comms is so critical too. So I'd really like to see people kind of be aware of that and start thinking forward, thinking more strategically in their planning, not just about, you know, what will we do, but why will we do it and with what impact.
That's really solid thinking. How would you like your work in the book to influence how we approach crisis comms in the next few years?
I would hope that people will start to think more intentionally about it. You know, the book's not perfect. My ideas aren't perfect. I'm not perfect. You know, this isn't, you know, the answer, but it's the start of a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I hope that people who are reading the book would recognize the value of that human first approach. And I hope they would take confidence in kind of applying that human first approach as much as possible. Obviously, I also hope that they would follow the 7S, because I think it works from my own practice, and I think it will be helpful to people. But again, that's for them to decide.
And finally, as we kind of wrap up today, you've been on the call, you've been in the kind of like those tough situations. What advice would you give your younger self or someone just stepping into their first crisis comms situation? What would you say that fundamentally you need to kind of remember?
Fundamentally, the more planned you are, the more confident you will be. So plan ahead, build those trusted relationships in advance, know who you can turn to for help, know who you can turn to for information, make sure your face is known in the organisation as a kind of helpful support, regardless of what level you're at. But also take care of yourself. You know, when a crisis happens, it's very, very unlikely that this will be something that you caused. So, you know, don't take that full burden onto your shoulders. You know, be aware that your job is not to cover up someone else's misdeeds. It's not to cover up bad behavior. That's not what crisis communication, or that's not what ethical crisis communication is about. Ethical crisis communication is about preventing harm. It's about supporting people. It's about helping them make sense of the situation and ultimately enabling the organisation to kind of return to normal or return to a new normal. That's what internal crisis comms is about. So don't feel obliged to kind of do things that go against your values or your instincts. You know, listen to those because they're important, and you have a long career ahead of you, and you'll be much happier in that career if you do follow your values, if you do follow your instincts, and if you recognize, you know, you aren't alone. There's always help there. Even if it's not inside the organisation, it's outside the organisation. So ask for that help if you need it, and you will find it coming your way. You will find, crisis comms people, but people in organisations generally, most of the time, they're really nice people. They want to help, they want to support, they want to enable. So ask for that, and it'll come to you.
I guess anyone listening to this podcast will have, it's come through loud and clear how passionate you are about this subject, and I'm just curious before we go, what keeps you interested and driven, and to the point where that all the time that you've sacrificed in writing a book and so on, what is the thing that drives you all these years on from Glasgow?
I think I believe that crisis comms can do good. It doesn't always have the best reputation, but I believe it can do good. It can do good for human beings. It can do good for organisations. All PR can, actually. So that, for me now, a lot of it's about the training. I mean, I genuinely, when you were asking for the advice for the younger self, I love training kind of early career professionals. I'm always really impressed by them. I kind of, you hear people moaning and complaining all the time, but actually I think the future of our industry is in really good hands. We've got really, really good people coming up into the industry now. And part of what keeps me going is, being able to help that, being able to enable that. And hopefully, through the training, through the book and so on, that's something that I've kind of come through it myself and now kind of giving a little bit backwards.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's been a real pleasure hearing your thoughts, and best of luck with the book. I'm sure it'll be a really popular and valuable read for countless PR professionals. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to PR in the Real World. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could subscribe to the podcast and leave us a quick review. Your support really helps spread the word and reach more marketing and PR professionals just like you. And don't forget to share this podcast with your colleagues or anyone who'd benefit from the insights we share. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for more tips, strategies and real world stories from the PR frontlines.